Why was the room colder than usual? Or was it just the way silence clung between the beeping of the heart monitor? The fluorescent lights burned overhead, unforgiving and bright, revealing every crease of tension on the surgeons' faces. A Navy SEAL lay torn apart on the table, his chest rising in uneven bursts, blood pooling faster than the suction could clear. The rhythm of life was fragile, breaking apart one shallow breath at a time. Clamp, suction. Faster, we're losing him, the chief surgeon barked, his voice sharp enough to cut glass. His tone was clinical, mechanical, but beneath it trembled something he would never admit: fear. Everyone in the room moved frantically. Gloved hands blurred, stainless steel tools clattered onto trays, sweat dripped under masks. All except her. The nurse. She stood at the surgeon's side, her face partially shadowed by her mask, her eyes calm. She was young, too young, some might whisper, but her hands didn't tremble, not once. She moved with an economy of motion, precise, efficient, almost unnervingly steady. "Don't just stand there," the surgeon snapped. "You're only a nurse, stay out of the way." Only a nurse. The words landed like a stamp pressed into her skin, hot, final. And yet she didn't flinch. She didn't answer. She simply leaned closer to the patient, her gaze tracing the mangled flesh, the failing pulse on the monitor. She saw what the others couldn't see. Then, so faint it almost passed unnoticed, the SEAL stirred. His lips parted. A cracked whisper floated into the sterile air. "You have no idea who she is." The room froze. The clamp stilled in the surgeon's hand. The anesthesiologist looked up, confused. A scrub nurse blinked, uncertain she'd heard right. The heart monitor beeped louder in the silence, reminding them that time was running out. The surgeon frowned. He thought the soldier was delirious, drowning in pain and morphine. But the nurse, her eyes flickered for just a moment. Not fear, not surprise, something else, something unreadable. She didn't speak. The SEAL tried again, his voice raw, scraping from somewhere deep inside a body that should have given up already. "Angel." It wasn't a prayer, it wasn't desperation, it was a call sign. Every surgeon in that room had heard rumors. A name carried through military whispers like smoke across campfires. A medic who was more than a medic. A ghost, a savior, a myth. Soldiers swore she had pulled entire units back from death's edge, though no official file recorded her existence. A rumor, a story, a legend. And now that word had been spoken here in this room, by a dying man. "Angel." The surgeon's chest tightened. He looked at the nurse differently now. She gave no reaction beyond the slightest shimmer in her eyes, a glisten she quickly buried. Then her voice cut through the stillness, not frantic, not begging. Calm, precise, commanding. "Open suction wider, increase pressure. You prepare another transfusion. And you adjust his airway, 5 degrees left." The surgeon hesitated. The arrogance in him recoiled. He was the authority here, not her. And yet something in her tone forced obedience. It wasn't a suggestion, it was experience distilled into words. Orders disguised as guidance. The team obeyed. Seconds bled into minutes. Minutes stretched into hours. The fight for the SEAL's life dragged them through exhaustion. Gloves tore and were replaced. Masks fogged with breath and sweat. Blood transfusions cycled in one after another. The man on the table kept failing, reviving, failing again. Every heartbeat was an argument against death, every pause a threat of finality. Through it all, she never broke. The nurse, Angel, pressed her hands against the wound with exact force, guided the rhythm of the room with subtle, steady commands. She absorbed the chaos around her and gave back control. Her eyes stayed sharp, unshaken. Where others faltered, she leaned forward closer, as if daring death to try harder. Outside, the world shifted. Dawn painted faint light across the hospital windows. A new day, but the room felt timeless, sealed away from sunrise or sunset. Inside, only the sound of beeping monitors and the dull rush of blood through tubes existed. And then finally, the SEAL's pulse steadied. Not strong, not safe, but steady. His chest rose in measured breaths. His color returned by degrees. Against every odd, against every falter, he lived. The room exhaled. A scrub nurse leaned against the wall, her gloves streaked with red. Another sat down heavily, her legs weak. The surgeon ripped his gloves off, his hands trembling. Sweat dripped from his forehead as his pride cracked under something heavier, recognition. He looked at the nurse. His voice, stripped of authority, came out quiet. "Who are you?" She removed her mask slowly. Her eyes were tired but unwavering. "I'm just a nurse." The surgeon didn't believe it. He couldn't. The seal on the table had called her something else, and her presence in that room had carried weight far beyond hospital walls. But she gave him nothing more. She turned, adjusted the blankets over the patient, and stepped back. Her movements were ordinary now, almost invisible, as if she could fade back into the background whenever she wished. The surgeon's gaze lingered. His arrogance earlier echoed like a mistake he would carry. He had dismissed her, reduced her, only a nurse, and yet she had held the line between life and death when he faltered. The wounded seal, drifting in the haze of fragile consciousness, murmured again. His lips barely moved. "Angel saved me." No one answered. The nurse glanced at him, her expression unreadable, then returned to charting vitals. She didn't confirm. She didn't deny. Some truths, she seemed to believe, were safer in silence. But the surgeon knew, and so did the seal. Long after she left the room, he sat in silence. The adrenaline crash shook him, but something deeper worked at him, a reflection he couldn't escape. How many others had he underestimated? How often had pride blinded him? The seal's survival was a miracle, yes, but miracles had hands. And tonight, those hands belonged to the one he had dismissed as ordinary. The hospital hallways outside smelled of antiseptic and coffee. Nurses bustled past, doctors checked charts, orderlies pushed stretchers. The world carried on with routine, but inside him something had shifted. He had glimpsed something hidden, something larger than the narrow frame of his own ego. She was just a nurse. That's what she had said. And yet he felt the words press against his thoughts with quiet defiance, because what he had seen wasn't ordinary. What he had seen belonged to the realm of whispered legends. Angel. And though the night had ended, her story was only beginning to surface, because legends don't rest in silence forever. They wait, patient, until the world needs reminding. And tonight, inside the cold light of an operating room, the world had remembered. What kind of courage does it take to run into gunfire when everyone else is scrambling to the ground? The question never left her mind. She was 22 the first time she laced combat boots and stepped onto foreign soil. The desert heat pressed against her skin like a furnace, the horizon stretching wide and merciless. She wasn't supposed to stand out. She was trained as a medic, her mission clear: patch wounds, stabilize, keep men breathing until they could be lifted away. Nothing glamorous, nothing heroic, just survival. But survival has a way of demanding more than orders ever anticipate. The convoy had been simple, too simple. A supply run through a valley road carved between jagged rock faces. She sat in the back of a Humvee, helmet tilted low, rifle at her side though she rarely touched it. She listened to the chatter in her headset, tried to calm the nerves in her chest. Every rookie deployment came with nerves. But hers were different, not fear of dying, but fear of failing. She didn't want to freeze, didn't want to let someone bleed out because her hands hesitated. The explosion answered her fear before she could test it. An IED ripped through the lead vehicle, lifting it into the air in a ball of flame. Shrapnel screamed across the valley. Her Humvee jolted sideways as the driver swerved, tires grinding against gravel. In seconds, gunfire followed, automatic bursts from the cliffs above, muzzle flashes sparking like lightning from stone. The convoy was caught in a kill box. Her ears rang. Dust and smoke stung her lungs. Men shouted, some firing back blindly at the cliffs, others scrambling for cover. And then, above the chaos, came the call that froze her blood. "Medic, we need a medic now." Her door swung open before she even thought. She hit the ground running, rifle strap bouncing against her shoulder, aid kit heavy against her back. Bullets cracked the dirt at her feet, chipped the rocks beside her. She didn't stop. Her eyes locked on the man sprawled in the open, blood pouring from his leg, arterial, spraying red into the sand. She dropped beside him, instincts taking over. Hands steady, pressure applied, tourniquet out. Her training was loud in her head, drowning out the battle. Stop the bleed, secure airway, check breathing. Her hands moved faster than thought. Another explosion shook the valley. Another soldier went down, chest ripped open by shrapnel. She could hear her commanding officer shouting for suppressing fire, for air support, for anything. But air support was minutes away, minutes too long. She finished the tourniquet, shoved bandages into the hands of a nearby private. Hold this, don't let go. She was already sprinting again, sliding into the dirt beside the next casualty. The wound was bad, too bad. Her fingers pressed deep, searching for what little time she could buy. Through the chaos, her voice cut sharp and clear. Not panicked, not trembling, calm. Stay with me, you hear me? Stay awake, look at me. The man coughed blood, his eyes rolled. She shook him once hard enough to drag him back. You're not leaving today, not here, not like this. Somehow her tone reached him where morphine couldn't. He focused. He clung. He lived long enough for her to stabilize him, long enough to matter. She dragged him back toward cover, bullets ricocheting off stone feet away. Her boots slipped in gravel, her arms screamed from effort, but she kept moving. By the time she pulled him behind a truck, her uniform was soaked in blood that wasn't hers. And still she went back. 3 times she crossed that killing field, each trip slower, heavier. By the time the helicopters roared overhead and air support pounded the cliffs, she was on her knees beside the last soldier, her hands sticky with drying blood, her breaths coming ragged. But her hands never shook. When the firing stopped, the valley fell into eerie silence. Smoke hung low, heavy with the smell of metal and fire. Bodies were counted. The wounded lined in rows, tagged, ready for evac. She sat in the dirt, back against the wheel of a Humvee, her head tilted back toward the blistering sky. The officer who approached her later said little. He just looked at the trail of wounded men she had kept alive against odds no training could prepare for. He looked at the way soldiers, hardened and weary, glanced at her with something like reverence. It was one of them who said it first, a whisper, half in disbelief, half in awe. She's an angel. The name stuck, not because she asked for it, not because she wanted it, but because those who survived carried it like a talisman. In their minds, she wasn't just a medic. She was the presence that appeared when hope had already bled out. She hated the name at first. It felt too heavy, too untrue. She was no angel. She was just a woman who refused to let men die alone. But in war, names aren't chosen. They're earned. Her legend began in that valley, but it didn't end there. Afghanistan bled into other deployments, jungles, cities, forgotten outposts. Each place stamped her deeper into silence, deeper into myth. She carried wounded through firestorms, improvised when supplies ran dry, stood her ground when retreat seemed the only sane option. And always her voice was the same, calm, steady, certain. She gave men more than bandages. She gave them something they couldn't explain. She gave them the will to hold on. She didn't talk about it when she came home. She never told her family the details. She never sat in bars retelling the moments that carved scars inside her. She let the silence hold it because silence was safer. But the men she saved carried her name like scripture. They passed it down, whispered in late-night barracks in hushed tones over campfires. Some said she once stood alone against an entire ambush. Others swore she dragged 5 men out of a burning convoy before collapsing herself. The stories blurred, shifted, became bigger than truth. And somewhere along the way, truth didn't matter anymore. The legend did. She never asked for it. She never wanted it. Which is why, years later, when she traded combat boots for hospital scrubs, She introduced herself simply as a nurse. No one needed to know who she had been. No one needed to dig into what the whispers meant. She wanted clean hallways, not dusty roads. She wanted to heal without the echoes of gunfire behind her. But legends don't die quietly. They live in scars, in memories, in the fragile breath of a man who once thought he wouldn't see another sunrise. And so when that seal lay broken on the operating table years later, his lips cracked, and the word fell from them. Angel, it wasn't delirium. It was memory. It was recognition. The surgeon dismissed her. Others overlooked her, but soldiers never forgot. Because once, in a valley painted with smoke and fire, a 22-year-old nurse ran into chaos when others ducked for cover. And that choice, the choice to run forward instead of back, became the start of a story that still refused to end. How many times can someone stare death in the face before it starts staring back from the mirror? She asked herself that in silence, though never out loud. Silence had become her refuge, her shield, her way of keeping the pieces of herself from unraveling. The deployments kept coming. One desert blurred into another, jungles into cities, nights into mornings. For others, time was measured by calendars and rotations home. For her, it was measured in scars, some visible, some buried so deep they never saw daylight. They started calling her name before she even arrived on missions. Soldiers whispered, "Angels with us." You could hear the relief in their voices, as if her presence tilted the odds in their favor. She never liked it, but she never corrected them either. Hope is fragile in war, too fragile to take away. Her reputation spread beyond her unit. In Kandahar, she was pulled into missions no medic should have been near. Hostage rescues, night raids, convoys sent into territories marked with red on the maps. They wanted her there not for orders, but for the unspoken truth. When Angel was present, men came back breathing. But the price of that truth was heavy. She remembered one night, blacker than most, when the team was inserted into a mountain village under moonless skies. Intelligence had been wrong, fatally wrong. Instead of a handful of insurgents, there were dozens. The firefight lasted hours, echoing through stone alleys, muzzle flashes carving lightning into the dark. She moved from body to body like a phantom, crouching low, dragging men into corners, pressing her hands into wounds until her arms burned. A sniper's bullet ricocheted off the wall inches from her head. She didn't even flinch. By then, fear had become something distant, something she no longer felt in her bones. But when dawn broke and the smoke lifted, 4 men were already gone. No skill could have saved them. No calm voice could have anchored them. She sat with them anyway, her gloves soaked through, her hands resting on still bodies as if she could will them back. The men who survived called her a savior. She only felt failure. And that's what people never saw when they spoke her name like a myth. They saw the ones who lived. They didn't see the weight of those who didn't. That weight dug into her chest, bone deep, every time she closed her eyes. Another mission, another scar. In the jungles of South America, her unit was ambushed on extraction. She spent hours crouched in the mud, her knees sinking, her voice steady as she coached a soldier with a collapsed lung to keep breathing. Slow, in, out, don't give it up. Not yet. She counted breaths with him until the helicopters finally broke the canopy and pulled them out. The soldier lived. But that night, while the others laughed in relief back at base, she sat outside the barracks alone, the sound of rotors still spinning in her ears. Her hands smelled of blood no soap could scrub out. She looked at her reflection in a metal canteen and thought, how long can I keep doing this before something inside me breaks? But she didn't stop. There was no stopping. Every mission blurred into the next, and each time her presence made men believe the impossible, that death could be delayed, denied, turned away. Her voice became the anchor in storms no one else could weather. And though she never asked for it, though she wished sometimes she could disappear into anonymity, the myth grew. It grew so large, it began to separate her from everyone else. She noticed it in small ways first. The way soldiers looked at her differently, not as one of them but as something untouchable. The way their stories of her didn't match reality, exaggerating, shaping her into someone she didn't recognize. The way new recruits whispered her name before they'd even met her, expecting a miracle in human form. And inside she felt the fracture widening, because she wasn't a miracle. She wasn't untouchable. She was human, bone, blood, heart. A heart that ached every time she sat with the dying, ached every time she held pressure on a wound knowing it wouldn't be enough. She hid it well. No one ever saw her hands shake. No one ever saw the nights she lay awake staring at the ceiling, the silence pressing down like a weight. No one knew how often she thought of walking away. But walking away felt like betrayal. How could she leave when men still needed her? How could she step out when her absence might mean another body uncounted, another family that never saw their son return? So she stayed. She stayed through one last deployment that nearly broke her. A raid in a crumbling city, smoke rising from rooftops, civilians scattering in panic. The team was cornered in a half-destroyed building, gunfire shredding walls, grenades rattling the floors. A young private was hit bad, abdomen torn open, bleeding fast. She crawled through debris to reach him, ignoring the burning glass embedded in her knees. The wound was catastrophic. She knew it the second she saw it, but she also knew giving up wasn't an option. She pressed her hands in deep, her voice low, her eyes locked on his. "You're not done, you hear me? Not today." The boy, he was barely more than a boy, gasped, his eyes wide with terror. Am I gonna make it?" Her throat tightened. She wanted to lie, she wanted to promise, but she couldn't. So she told him the only truth she had. "You're not alone." She stayed with him until the very last breath. And then she closed his eyes with her own hands, the roar of battle echoing around her. When it was over, when the survivors were airlifted out, the men spoke of her again in hushed reverence. She never left him. She stayed till the end. They said it as proof of her legend. To her, it was proof of her breaking. That night she made her choice. When her service ended, she didn't re-enlist. She didn't chase promotions, medals, recognition. She walked away quietly. She traded her rifle for scrubs, her battlefield for sterile hallways, the sound of gunfire for the steady hum of hospital machines. She told herself it was healing. That here, in the civilian world, she could still use her hands for life without death breathing down her neck. She told herself she could be ordinary again. But legends don't die in silence. They wait. They wait for the moment someone remembers. And so years later, when a seal torn apart by shrapnel lay on her operating table, when he cracked his lips and whispered "Angel," it wasn't just memory returning. It was truth refusing to stay buried. The surgeon didn't understand. The other nurses didn't know. But the soldier did. Even through pain, even through haze, he remembered. Because legends don't belong to those who carry them. They belong to those who survive because of them. And whether she admitted it or not, whether she liked it or not, Angel's story wasn't finished. Why do some stories refuse to stay buried? She asked herself that every morning she pulled on her scrubs, every night she walked home under the humming streetlights. She wanted simplicity now. She wanted to fade into the quiet rhythm of ordinary life shifts, coffee breaks, charting vitals, comforting families. But simplicity never truly came. The hospital was its own battlefield, though dressed in softer colors. The war here wasn't fought with rifles and explosions, but with time and fragility. Here, the enemy was silence, lungs that refused to fill, hearts that faltered without warning, the cruel clock that decided who made it through the night and who didn't. She was good at her job, too good. Other nurses admired her steady hands, the way she could calm patients no one else could reach. Doctors relied on her in crises without realizing how instinctively they deferred to her. Families trusted her, even when they didn't understand why. But every time someone thanked her, every time someone looked at her with gratitude too heavy, something inside her tightened. Because she knew the truth, she wasn't saving everyone. She wasn't the legend they thought she might be. She was only delaying the inevitable. She was only human. Still, she worked in silence. She carried her shifts like armor, never boasting, never revealing. When colleagues asked about her past, she spoke only in fragments, medical training, deployments, nothing more. She let them assume she had been like any other medic, ordinary, forgettable. She wanted it that way. But the past has a cruel habit of clawing through walls you build. It began with the SEAL. After the surgery, his recovery was slow, fragile. His body was broken in ways no stitch could completely mend, but his spirit, his stubbornness, kept him alive. And every time he opened his eyes, every time he caught a glimpse of her in the room, he remembered. "Angel," he whispered once, voice hoarse, lips barely moving. She froze, a chart in her hand, a syringe balanced carefully between her fingers. She didn't answer. She didn't acknowledge it. She turned and continued her work, silent as ever. But he kept saying it, not always aloud, sometimes only in the way his eyes followed her, the way relief softened his face when she entered. He knew who she was, or at least he knew enough. The surgeon noticed, too. He had been humbled in that operating room, shaken by his own blindness. Since then, he found himself watching her differently, not in suspicion but in something closer to awe. He had never believed in rumors. He had never cared for whispers about battlefield myths. But now, standing beside her during late-night shifts, he caught glimpses of a depth he couldn't explain. One night, as they leaned over a patient coding on the table, she moved with a precision that made him feel like a student again. When it was over, when the patient's heart steadied and the adrenaline thinned from the room, he asked quietly, "Who taught you that?" She didn't look at him. "Experience." He pressed, "Combat." Her eyes flickered for a fraction of a second before she shook her head. "I told you, I'm just a nurse." But he knew better. The whispers began to ripple through the hospital soon after. A wounded SEAL recovering, a surgeon unsettled, a nurse who seemed to know too much, act too swiftly, carry herself with a calm that didn't match her years. Stories always find ears eager for mystery. She hated it. Every time she walked down the hall, every time someone's eyes lingered a little longer than before, she felt the walls closing in. She had left that life behind for a reason. She didn't want to be Angel anymore. She wanted to be nameless, ordinary, invisible. But soldiers don't forget. Weeks later, when the SEAL was strong enough to leave his bed, he asked to see her. She hesitated at his door, hand on the frame, debating whether to step inside. When she finally did, his face broke into a smile cracked by scars but warm with recognition. "You never change," he said softly. Her breath caught. She wanted to deny it, to tell him he was mistaken, that the Angel he remembered was someone else. But his eyes were steady. He knew. And for a moment, she felt the weight of all those battlefields pressing into this quiet hospital room. She sat by his bed, silent. He didn't ask for details. He didn't ask her why she was here, why she had buried her name. He only said, "You saved me. Again." Her throat tightened. She wanted to tell him the truth, that she hadn't saved everyone, that for every man who lived, another slipped through her fingers. She wanted to confess that the legend people clung to wasn't real, not entirely. But she didn't. She only said, "Rest. That's all you need to do now." And she stood and she left, before her silence cracked. But the encounter lingered in her mind. It stirred something she had fought hard to bury. For years she had carried the guilt of those she couldn't save, the nights when her voice and her hands weren't enough. She thought walking away, hiding in the halls of a hospital, would make the weight lighter. But now it pressed heavier because the past had followed her here. She began to dream again. Not ordinary dreams, but fragments of memory, gunfire echoing through valleys, blood on her gloves, the faces of men who never made it home. She woke with sweat on her skin, staring at the ceiling, her chest tight. And in those nights, one question haunted her. Was she running from her past or from herself? The surgeon noticed the shadows under her eyes. The SEAL noticed the way her voice softened when she thought no one was listening. The whispers in the hospital grew louder, but she told no one the truth. Because the truth wasn't a story people wanted to hear. The truth was that heroes break, legends bleed, angels fall. Still, she carried on with her shifts. Still, she moved through the hospital with quiet resilience. She bandaged wounds, she comforted children, she steadied dying hands with the same tenderness she once gave to soldiers in the field. And though she tried to tell herself it was enough, deep down she knew the past doesn't vanish. It waits. It waits for the moment when silence is no longer an option. One evening, as she walked out of the hospital into the cold night air, she paused. Across the street, two veterans stood smoking, their voices carrying just enough for her to hear. "You ever hear the stories? The medic they called Angel." The other man exhaled smoke, nodding. "Yeah, heard she saved more men than a whole battalion. Some say she's still out there, working somewhere quiet, like she just disappeared." Her chest tightened. She turned and walked away quickly, the weight of their words pressing harder with each step. She wanted to scream that they were wrong, that she wasn't that person anymore, that she was only a nurse. But the echo of their voices followed her into the night. Legends don't die, they haunt. And hers was coming back to life, whether she wanted it or not. What happens when the world you've left behind suddenly finds you again? She never planned for it. She thought she could hide in plain sight, behind her scrubs, behind the rhythm of hospital life. But fate doesn't ask for permission. It simply pulls you back when it chooses. It began on an ordinary night. Ordinary, at least, by the standards of a hospital that measured time in codes and emergencies. Her shift had ended hours earlier. She walked home through streets wet with rain, the neon signs blurring in puddles, the air sharp with city noise. She liked the walk. It reminded her she wasn't in a war zone anymore. Cars honked. People laughed outside bars. No gunfire, no explosions, just life, unremarkable and loud. She turned a corner, and the sound cut different. Shouting, desperation. A car screeching, then slamming into a pole. She froze for a fraction of a second before instinct overrode thought. She ran. The scene unfolded fast. A sedan crumpled against the streetlight, smoke curling from the hood, the windshield spiderwebbed. A man stumbled out, clutching his side, blood pouring between his fingers. Another passenger, motionless inside. People crowded around, their voices panicked, overlapping. "Call 911. He's bleeding out. Somebody do something." Nobody moved closer. Nobody knew what to do. She dropped her bag and was already at the man's side. "I need pressure here," she ordered, her voice sharp, calm, commanding. The crowd startled, confused. No one questioned her tone. Her hands pressed firm against the wound, her eyes scanning. "Arterial, bad, but not impossible. You ripped that shirt. Now, make it into a bandage." Her finger pointed to a man in the crowd who blinked, startled, then obeyed without a word. The rhythm returned to her like muscle memory. Like the valley in Afghanistan. Like the jungle. Like the crumbling city walls where she once whispered to a boy he wasn't alone. She barked orders, improvised with what she had, moved with a steadiness that silenced panic. By the time sirens wailed in the distance, the bleeding was controlled, the man semi-conscious, alive. She shifted to the passenger, shattered glass cutting into her palms as she forced the door open. The woman inside was limp, her breathing shallow, head tilted at a dangerous angle. She stabilized the airway, supported the neck, whispered softly though the woman couldn't hear. "Stay with me, just stay." The paramedics arrived minutes later, but minutes felt like lifetimes. They rushed in with gurneys, their eyes catching hers, bloodied hands, improvised bandages, calm in chaos. They recognized competence immediately. "Are you medic?" one asked. She shook her head once, stepping back, already wiping blood from her arms with shaking hands. "No," she whispered, "I'm just a nurse." But they knew better. The victims were loaded, lives no longer slipping. The crowd began to disperse, murmuring about the woman who had taken control, who had moved like she'd done this 100 times. Whispers trailed her as she picked up her bag, her clothes soaked in red. She walked home with her chest tight. Every step felt heavier. She had tried so hard to bury it, to lock Angel away in the past. But the moment chaos came, she hadn't hesitated. She hadn't thought. She had run forward, always forward. At her apartment, she scrubbed her hands raw in the sink, watching the water swirl pink, then red, then clear. Her reflection in the mirror stared back with the same unflinching eyes she remembered from the battlefield, eyes she had tried to forget. The next morning, the whispers had already reached the hospital. A nurse told her, "They're talking about you, what you did last night, saving those people." Her throat closed. She hadn't told anyone. She hadn't planned to, but the city had eyes. Someone had filmed it on their phone. By noon, a video circulated, grainy footage of a woman in scrubs commanding a scene, her hands soaked in blood, her voice calm as she stabilized a stranger on the street. The surgeon saw it. So did the SEAL, still recovering in his ward. She tried to keep her head down, to bury herself in routine. But by evening, the surgeon found her in the break room. He held up his phone, the video paused mid-frame, her crouched over the victim, eyes locked in focus. "That wasn't just a nurse," he said quietly. Her chest tightened. "I told you." He cut her off. "I don't care what you call yourself, but I know what I saw." She looked away. The weight of silence pressed heavy. She wanted to argue, she wanted to scream, but she couldn't, because deep down she knew he was right. Later that night, the SEAL called for her. She almost didn't go, almost pretended she hadn't heard, but something in his voice through the door made her step inside. He was sitting upright now, pale but stronger, his scars stark against his skin. He looked at her with that same unwavering recognition. "They're talking about you," he said softly. "They don't know, but I do." Her breath caught, she shook her head. "I walked away, that life is over." He studied her in silence, then said the words she had tried so hard not to hear. "You can't walk away from who you are." The room went still. She felt the truth of it sink into her bones. For years she had fought to be ordinary, but ordinary had never fit. Ordinary couldn't erase what she had done, who she had been, the lives she had carried. She left the room shaken. Outside in the hallway, she leaned against the wall, her eyes closing. The noise of the hospital carried on around her, beeping monitors, distant voices, hurried footsteps, but inside her something deeper stirred. Maybe the SEAL was right. Maybe you couldn't erase the past. Maybe some names, some burdens never let go. She opened her eyes, and for the first time in years she allowed herself to whisper it, so softly only the walls heard. "Angel." The word tasted of salt, of memory, of grief and defiance tangled together. It wasn't pride. It wasn't comfort. It was surrender. Because no matter how far she ran, no matter how quietly she lived, the truth followed. She wasn't only a nurse, she never had been. And soon, she would have to decide whether to keep hiding, or to embrace the weight of the name she had tried so hard to bury. What if the past knocked on your door and refused to leave? She had asked herself that countless times in the silence of her apartment. She never thought she'd hear the answer so soon. It began with a phone call. No name, no caller ID, just silence on the other end before a voice finally spoke, low, gravelly, the kind you don't forget once you've heard it. "Angel." Her hand tightened around the phone. It had been years since anyone called her that directly, without hesitation. For a long moment she didn't breathe. Then, with practiced steadiness, she answered, "You have the wrong number." The voice didn't waver. We need you." Her chest constricted, she hung up. But the past doesn't vanish because you close a door. Hours later, when she stepped out of the hospital after a shift, two men stood waiting by the curb. Their posture wasn't casual, their eyes scanning, assessing. She recognized it instantly: military. Not just military, special operations. She thought about walking past them, pretending she didn't know. But when one of them said her name, not Angel but her real one, she stopped. "Ma'am," he said with a nod, respectful, firm, "we'd like a word." She felt the weight in her gut before he even spoke again. "There's a situation, stateside. We need someone with your experience, with your reputation." Reputation. The word felt like a chain snapping shut. "I'm not that person anymore," she said, her voice flat. "I left." The other man stepped forward, lowering his voice. "You can leave the uniform, you can leave the medals, but you don't leave what you are, not when lives are on the line." She turned sharply and walked away, forcing herself not to look back. Her hands trembled in her pockets, unseen. That night she couldn't sleep. She stared at the ceiling, the shadows of city lights crawling across her walls. She thought about the lives she'd saved, the ones she hadn't, the whispers of her name echoing through men who still breathed because of her. She thought about the SEAL recovering in the hospital, his eyes full of recognition she couldn't escape. By morning she tried to bury it again. Scrubs on, hair tied back, another shift. Patients waited, charts piled up, the rhythm of ordinary life pressed forward. But under it all she carried the echo of that voice. "We need you." And the world, as if conspiring, didn't let her forget. That evening she found the SEAL sitting in his wheelchair by the window, his gaze on the horizon. When she entered, he didn't look away. "They came for you, didn't they?" he asked softly. Her pulse spiked. "Who told you that?" "No one had to." His lips curved into the faintest, tired smile. "I know how this works. Legends don't retire, they just rest until they're called again." She wanted to argue. She wanted to tell him he was wrong, but the truth weighed heavier than denial. She sank into the chair across from him, her hands clasped tight. "I can't go back," she whispered. He studied her for a long moment, then asked the question that pierced deeper than any wound. "Is it because you won't, or because you're afraid?" Her breath caught, afraid. The word struck something raw, not afraid of bullets, not of death. She had faced those. She was afraid of herself, of who she became in the field, of the part of her that didn't hesitate to run forward when others ducked for cover. She was afraid that once Angel returned, the woman she had tried to become would disappear completely. She stood abruptly, her throat tight. "Rest," she said, her voice clipped, and she left before he could read the truth in her silence. But that night, she found a letter slipped under her apartment door. No return address. Just a folded sheet of paper with coordinates and a single line. "Lives depend on you." Her fingers trembled as she held it. She should burn it. She should throw it away. But instead she set it on the table, staring at it until dawn painted the sky pale gray. She remembered every face, the ones she saved, the ones she lost. She remembered the young private who asked if he would make it, and the only thing she could give him was presence. She remembered the officer who whispered Angel, as if saying the word alone could keep him breathing. And she remembered the way she swore she was done, that she could build a life outside the shadows of war. But shadows cling. The next day she walked into the hospital as if nothing had changed. She checked charts, adjusted IVs, offered quiet smiles, but beneath the surface her decision was already forming. Because she knew what the others were right about. She could walk away from the uniform. She could walk away from medals, whispers, and myths, but she couldn't walk away from who she was when chaos broke. She wasn't only a nurse. She wasn't only a medic. She was something forged in fire and blood, something she never asked to be but couldn't undo. And deep down she knew, if lives truly hung in the balance, she wouldn't stand aside. She never had. That night she picked up the folded paper again. She memorized the coordinates. She didn't call anyone. She didn't explain. She only packed a small bag, slipped into dark clothes, and left her apartment in silence. The city lights fell away behind her. The road stretched ahead, empty and waiting. And with every mile, she felt the weight of a name she had tried so hard to bury settling back onto her shoulders. Not as a choice, as inevitability. Angel was returning. What happens when the battlefield you swore you left behind calls you back and you answer? She hadn't felt this weight in years, the pack on her shoulders, the cold metal of a weapon not for offense but for defense if the night turned against her, the silence of men who moved with discipline, not questions. The rendezvous point was an unmarked warehouse on the edge of the city. Dim lights, reinforced doors, no signs. Inside, men in plain clothes but with military bearing waited. She saw it in their posture, the way they scanned corners, the economy of their movements. Operators, younger than she remembered being but carrying the same quiet steel. They didn't greet her with ceremony. No salutes, no titles, just a nod of recognition. And beneath it, respect. Not because she asked for it, but because of what they'd heard, what they believed. A man stepped forward, older, gray streaking his beard, his eyes sharp. "We weren't sure you'd come." She shrugged, her voice flat. "Neither was I." He studied her for a long moment. "We need you for one night, that's all. High-risk extraction. Civilians caught in a situation gone wrong. Too volatile for local authorities, too urgent for delays. We move fast, quiet, precise." She nodded once, the rhythm already returning, though she hated how natural it felt. Gear was laid out. She fitted it without hesitation, her hands remembering straps, clips, adjustments her body hadn't touched in years. Every piece clicked into place like it had been waiting. She caught her reflection in a dark window, helmet, vest, rifle slung low, and for a moment the breath caught in her chest. She had promised herself she would never look like this again, but here she was. The mission unfolded in whispered briefings. A safe house, hostages inside, armed men holding them as leverage for something ugly. The team would breach, clear, extract. Simple on paper, never simple in reality. She wasn't there to fight. She reminded herself of that. She was there for what always drew her forward, to keep people alive. The night swallowed them as they moved, streets narrow, lamps dim, shadows stretching. Her boots touched the ground with the same silent rhythm she thought she had forgotten, but her body remembered, every sense sharpened, every sound magnified. The thrum of her pulse was steady, not frantic. At the staging point, the leader gave hand signals. The team fanned out, breach in 3, 2, 1. The explosion of force was immediate. A door shattered, boots thundered, shouts cracked through the night. Gunfire answered, sharp, chaotic. She stayed low, behind the shield of men who cleared rooms with practiced precision. Her focus wasn't on enemies. It was on the small voices screaming from inside. The hostages. She found them huddled in the back, eyes wide, faces pale. A mother clutching her child. An older man clutching his chest. Another with blood streaming from a cut across his forehead. Fear hung heavy in the room, thick enough to choke. She moved fast. "It's okay. We're here. You're safe now." Her voice was steady, low, the same tone she'd used in deserts, in jungles, in bombed-out buildings. Her hands checked wounds, improvised bandages from what she carried. She stabilized the man with the chest pain, calmed the child whose sobs shook uncontrollably. But the firefight wasn't done. The walls trembled with impact. Shouts in a language she didn't recognize echoed through hallways. She knew better than to assume safety. "Move them," she barked to the nearest operator. "Now back route, keep low." The man hesitated. She wasn't in command. But her voice carried something that left no room for debate. He obeyed. Gunfire erupted closer. The team fell back in coordinated bursts, covering each other, guiding civilians through the maze of halls. She stayed at the rear, her body between danger and those she was sworn, by choice, by instinct, by something deeper, to protect. A round punched through plaster inches from her head. Dust stung her eyes. She didn't flinch. She kept moving, one hand on the shoulder of a terrified boy, the other gripping her rifle tight, though she prayed she wouldn't need to fire. Outside, engines roared, extraction vehicles. The team pushed civilians into the armored convoy, shouting over the chaos. She climbed in last, her chest heaving not from fear, but from the flood of memory pressing in with every heartbeat. As the vehicle sped into the night, she checked vitals, wrapped wounds, whispered comfort. The mother clutched her child tighter, tears streaking her face. "You saved us," she whispered. The words stabbed deep. She wanted to correct her. "I didn't save you. I just refused to let you die." But she held her tongue. Some truths were better left unspoken. Back at the safe zone, the civilians were handed over, alive, shaken, but breathing. The team began to strip gear, voices low, relief muted. For them, it was another mission done. For her, it was something heavier. The leader approached her as she sat on a crate, gloves stained, sweat drying cold on her skin. "You haven't lost it," he said. "Not a compliment, a statement." She shook her head. "I never wanted it." He studied her in silence, then crouched closer. "You can keep pretending. You can keep hiding. But you know as well as I do, this is who you are. Not because of legend, not because of whispers, because when chaos comes, you're the one who runs in." Her throat tightened. She wanted to argue. She wanted to say she was tired, broken, done. But the words stuck, because he was right. She left before dawn, slipping away without goodbye. She walked home as the city woke, commuters filling streets, the ordinary rhythm resuming. She moved among them unnoticed, just another figure in scrubs beneath a jacket. But inside, she knew something had shifted. The seal she had placed over her past was cracked beyond repair. She could never be only a nurse, not when the world still carried chaos, not when lives still depended on someone willing to run forward. She closed her apartment door and leaned against it, her eyes closing. The silence pressed heavy, and for the first time she didn't whisper denial. For the first time, she admitted the truth she had fought for years to bury. She was Angel. Not because of choice, not because of legend, but because when everything fell apart, she couldn't be anything else. Why do some people carry the heaviest burdens in silence? Maybe because the truth isn't meant for headlines or medals. Maybe because real strength doesn't announce itself, it just acts. The days after the mission blurred. She went back to the hospital as if nothing had happened, scrubs instead of body armor, charting vitals instead of carrying rifles. For everyone around her, it was ordinary life again. But inside, she knew nothing was ordinary anymore. The surgeon noticed first. He saw it in her eyes when she leaned over a patient, the way she carried herself with a steadiness no training program in the world could replicate. He didn't press, but his silence carried its own kind of reverence. The seal noticed too. Each time she entered his room, his gaze followed her, not with suspicion, not with doubt, but with quiet gratitude. He didn't say Angel aloud anymore. He didn't have to. She could see it in his expression, recognition, respect, memory. And the whispers didn't stop. Soldiers who passed through the hospital caught her name in fragments, half spoken, half denied. Some swore she was the medic who had saved them years ago. Others insisted she was a myth, just a story. She let them wonder. She let the silence answer for her. But at night, when she walked home through streets washed in the hum of traffic and neon light, she thought about the truth she carried. She thought about the lives she saved, about the ones she couldn't, about the boy who asked if he would make it, and the only thing she could give him was her presence. She thought about every whisper of her name across battlefields and how none of them belonged to her. The name belonged to the men who lived because of it. One evening she sat on a park bench, watching families scatter across the grass. Children laughing, parents chasing, life carrying on in colors far brighter than the muted tones of her memories. She sat in her scrubs, quiet, anonymous. No one there knew who she was. No one there cared. And for once she felt peace in that. Because she finally understood. She didn't need the world to remember. She didn't need to be called a legend or a myth. She didn't need Angel carved into whispers forever. All she ever wanted was to make sure someone else had another sunrise. That night the seal was discharged. Before he left, he stopped her in the hallway. His uniform was neat, but his steps were slow, cane tapping lightly against the floor. "Before I go," he said, "I need to say something." She braced herself. She didn't want praise, she didn't want gratitude, but his words came soft, almost broken. "You remind us that dignity doesn't need to shout. That real strength isn't in the noise. It's in the silence, in the way you never turned away." Her throat tightened. She couldn't speak. She only nodded, and he understood. When he walked away, she stood in the empty hallway, the hum of fluorescent lights above, the echo of his cane fatting. And she realized something she had never admitted to herself. She wasn't running anymore. She wasn't hiding. She was both things, angel and nurse, the battlefield and the hospital, the myth and the woman who just wanted to heal. She could carry both. She could live with both. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. Weeks passed. The city carried on. New patients arrived, old ones left, life spun forward in its endless rhythm. But every so often she caught a whisper in the air, an old soldier recognizing her eyes, a veteran pausing mid-sentence when he saw her steady hands, a stranger repeating a rumor they couldn't trace. She never confirmed it. She never denied it. She let the legend live where it belonged, in the memories of those who carried it, not in her own voice. Because she understood now. True strength doesn't need recognition. True heroism doesn't demand attention. And sometimes the greatest warriors are the ones we dismiss as ordinary. Late one night, walking home under a sky spattered with stars, she paused. The city noise softened for a moment, as if holding its breath. She looked up, her face tilted toward the infinite dark above, and whispered words no one else would hear. "I'm just a nurse." And yet, in her heart, she carried the truth unspoken, that sometimes being just was enough to change the world for those who needed her most. Because legends don't live in medals or in books. They live in scars, in whispers, in lives saved quietly. And her legend, the one they called Angel, would remain, not in her voice but in theirs. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts.